Silence. It's not just the absence of sound, it's the loudest presence when pain is involved. There are few things more brutal than being wounded by someone you trusted and left in the cold, echoing silence of their absence. Not just the silence of words, but of conscience. They walked away as if nothing happened, as if your tears were meaningless, as if your soul didn't shatter beneath the weight of their indifference. And the worst part? You stayed quiet. You didn't fight. You didn't scream. You didn't beg them to see the damage. You endured the silence, hoping your loyalty would speak louder than their betrayal. But it didn't. And so you learned something sacred, something terrifying and holy, that silence has a memory, that it doesn't vanish, it echoes through time. It waits in the shadows, and it returns. The very silence that was used to hurt you, the unanswered calls, the empty apologies, the stone-hearted ignoring of your presence, becomes the same silence that God will use to discipline those who broke you. Because when God judges, He doesn't always use fire or thunder. Sometimes He simply allows someone to be crushed under the weight of their own silence, the kind that once destroyed you. Have you ever looked back and wondered how they were able to walk away so easily? How someone could damage your heart, bury the knife deeper, and then act as if it were your fault? That coldness, that lack of remorse, it was louder than 1,000 insults. But here's the mystery. God watched the silence. He measured it. He counted the days you wept without a response, the nights you longed for just one sign that they cared, and He took note of the silence they weaponized. There's a divine irony to the way God works. He doesn't always confront people with noise and chaos. No. Sometimes He simply withdraws His presence. Sometimes He lets them sit in the very same stillness they imposed on you. And in that sacred quiet, something begins to break. What they once called peace becomes their punishment. What they once enjoyed as distance becomes their despair. The same silence they forced you to suffer will become the silence that undoes them. They will wait for validation and receive nothing. They will search for comfort and find none. They will speak into the void and hear no response. And it won't be because you've turned your back, but because heaven has. Do not mistake your silence for weakness. It was worship. It was restraint. It was you handing over your pain to a just God who writes His sentences in silence and executes justice without sound. God doesn't always shout His vengeance. Sometimes He lets life whisper it back to those who thought they'd never be held accountable. And when it returns to them, the loneliness, the void, the longing, they won't understand at first. But slowly, they'll remember. And in remembering, they'll feel the weight. That's what divine silence does. It doesn't just punish. It awakens. You were not broken for nothing. You were not ignored for no reason. You were not left behind by accident. God was watching, and now He is speaking, not in words, but in the orchestrated silence that only heaven can command. And the one who hurt you, they will feel the ache of being unseen. They will pray and hear nothing. They will reach out and be met with distance. They will hunger for the warmth they once rejected, because the silence that once suffocated you is now the very silence God will use to humble them. So don't curse the silence, embrace it, for it is both your evidence and your sword, and in the quiet, God is making justice known. God uses silence as a tool of divine justice, not abandonment. There's a sacred mystery in the way God responds to suffering. When the cries of the innocent rise up, when the broken-hearted sit quietly in pain, we often wonder, Why doesn't God thunder from the heavens? Why doesn't he stop the hurt the moment it starts? It's easy to confuse his silence with indifference, but divine silence is not absence. It's a tool, a holy weapon more precise than any word. When God goes quiet, he is never blind. He is watching every detail. He's not inactive. He's preparing a response deeper than any sound could carry. You see, when someone hurts you and leaves you to suffer in silence, it feels like God has turned his face away. It feels as if heaven agrees with your pain, nodding along with your despair. But what if that stillness is not neglect, but calibration? What if God is aligning the heavens to ensure that justice will not just be served, but felt? In his silence, God allows time to pass, not to forget the wound, but to allow its weight to settle, to make sure the one who inflicted it can never claim ignorance or escape its consequences. People often mistake delay for denial, but with God, delay is design. Silence is the courtroom of heaven. It is where God draws the outline of justice, not with loud proclamations, but with stillness that echoes through time. Think of the prophets, the martyrs, the quiet sufferers. Each one endured seasons where it seemed God was silent, but every time, without fail, that silence became a setup for a divine shift. The tables turned, the wrongs were remembered, and justice came like a flood. When someone wounds you and walks away without remorse, God does not rush to speak. He lets the silence build. He lets it become a mirror for the one who did the harm. In that mirror, they begin to see not just what they did, but who they are. And in the silence, they begin to feel what they made you feel: the emptiness, the isolation, the echo of prayers that seem unanswered. Only now, it's not a test of endurance like it was for you. It's judgment. God's silence has a heartbeat. It's alive. It listens. It gathers the whispers of your prayers, the suppressed sobs, the moments when you smiled through the ache. It stores them not in forgetfulness, but in a chamber of justice that only God can open. And when the time is right, he doesn't shout back. He simply lets the silence speak for itself. The one who hurt you will begin to feel the silence they once ignored. They will pray but feel a distance. They will seek validation and find emptiness, and the more they try to escape it, the louder it grows. Because this is how God works. He doesn't need to shout to be heard. He doesn't need thunder to reveal truth. Sometimes he uses the same silence they used against you and let it echo into their soul until it breaks them open. God is not absent in silence. He is crafting a justice so personal, so precise, that when it comes, the one who hurt you will know, without question, that heaven never forgot you. The silence that once broke you is the silence that will now teach them. There is a pain in being unheard that words can never fully describe. It's not just the lack of response, it's the shattering of hope in each moment you wait to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be held. When someone hurts you and then chooses silence over reconciliation, they are not just avoiding conflict, they are denying your humanity. They are pretending you are invisible, and in that invisibility you are left to bleed silently, to gather the pieces of your soul alone. But you did something remarkable in that silence. You survived. Not because you were okay, but because you were faithful. You didn't lash out. You didn't fight fire with fire. You didn't scream your worth into a void. You waited. You whispered to God in the dark. And while that silence nearly destroyed you, it also refined you. It taught you patience. It revealed your strength. And most importantly, it positioned you under the shelter of divine justice. Now, the same silence, the exact form of emotional absence they used to punish you, will become their teacher. Life has a way of turning tables without noise. God doesn't need to orchestrate revenge in drama or chaos. Sometimes He simply allows people to feel the emptiness they created. And when they are finally ready to speak, no one will be listening. When they reach for comfort, none will come. When they remember you, it will be in regret, not victory. Silence in God's hands is a teacher like no other. It doesn't lecture. It doesn't debate. It reveals. And what it reveals cannot be escaped. The one who hurt you may have been able to ignore your pain, but they will not be able to ignore their own. Their own silence will become deafening, and it won't be from your absence. It will be from God's distance. He will not allow them to feel the connection they threw away so carelessly. You, who sat silently in pain, will now watch as they sit silently in reflection. But theirs will not be the silence of growth. It will be the silence of guilt, of missed chances, of haunting memories. They will remember the things they didn't say, the apologies they never gave, the moments they let their pride choke their compassion. And that memory will be their mirror. God allows silence to teach lessons that words never can. Because silence doesn't just show you what you did, it shows you who you've become. And that is the crushing truth. The one who hurt you will not just regret the action, they will regret the silence. Because it was in their silence that they declared their character. It was in their silence that they showed who you truly were to them. Now God, in perfect justice, lets that silence speak back to them, not in revenge, but in revelation. And nothing is more painful than the moment you realize you silenced someone who would have given you everything. And now, no one speaks your name in love again. When God is silent with the one who hurt you, it becomes unbearable for them. To be ignored by a human is painful, but to be ignored by God? That's torment beyond description. You see, the person who hurt you may have found silence easy. It cost them nothing to ghost you, to overlook your emotions, to act like you never mattered. They silenced your cries, withheld affection, denied closure, and walked away as if your presence was disposable. But now comes the turning. Now God steps in, not with noise, but with divine silence. And when God goes silent on the one who inflicted pain, that silence becomes a burden, too heavy to carry. There is a difference between the silence you endured and the silence they will experience. Your silence was filled with searching, healing, and hope. Theirs will be filled with confusion, loneliness, and the slow erosion of peace. You reached out to God during your pain, and though it felt quiet, He was holding you. But when they reach for Him, He will allow the quiet to teach them what they refused to learn through compassion. When someone who's wounded others starts to feel God's silence, they don't know how to handle it, because they never learned how to sit in accountability. They've always had an escape route, someone else to blame, another path to walk away from their conscience. But this time, there's no detour, there's no distraction, just stillness, and the kind of stillness that screams. They may call it anxiety or an ache or a vague emptiness, but what it truly is the withdrawal of divine warmth, that moment when heaven steps back, not to destroy them, but to awaken them. And in that awakening, everything changes. They begin to question why peace is gone, why doors are closing, why their charm no longer works, why their prayers echo instead of being answered. Because when God stops speaking, He's actually showing. He's showing that their actions have consequences, that the same silence they used to dismiss you has now become their teacher. They may try to fill the void with relationships, with work, with distractions, but it won't work, because divine silence is not circumstantial, it follows them. It speaks through closed doors, through unanswered prayers, through a loneliness they can't explain. And that's when the realization begins, that the person they silenced was the very person sent into their life as a gift, that the pain they caused has returned, not through your voice, but through God's distance. When God is silent with someone, it's not always punishment. Sometimes it's grace. But when it follows cruelty, when it comes after unrepented harm, that silence is unbearable. Because it is through that silence that the soul is convicted. It's where the weight of wrongdoing is no longer avoidable. It's where the soul feels naked, exposed before a God who has chosen not to console, but to correct. And what they once mocked, your silence, your stillness, your walking away, they will now understand, because they'll find themselves screaming into an emptiness they created, and they will wish they had responded when you reached out. They will wish they had apologized when you were still listening. But now, God lets them feel what you felt, and without a word, He shows them everything. You endured in silence, but they will be punished by it. There is a kind of silence that strengthens you, the kind where you swallow pain, hold back tears, and let your dignity rise above revenge. You've known this silence. You've walked through days where you wanted to speak your truth, to yell, to demand justice, but instead you stayed quiet, not out of fear, but out of faith. You believed God would vindicate you. You trusted that what was done in the dark would not remain hidden. And so you endured, not because you were weak, but because you were wise. You endured in silence while they lived loudly, carelessly, and without remorse. They misunderstood your silence as powerlessness. They thought you were forgettable, that you wouldn't fight back, that your silence meant you had no voice. But it wasn't weakness, it was surrender, not to them, but to God. You handed over your battle to heaven and let divine justice write your defense. And now that same silence becomes their punishment. Because while you were healing, they were ignoring. While you were crying, they were laughing. While you were begging God to take away the ache, they were stacking up reasons for judgment. But God saw the contrast. He watched the cruelty and the humility. He saw your restraint, and now He lets silence revisit them. Not as peace, but as consequence. When a soul that once ignored pain begins to feel abandoned, it doesn't know how to cope. They were always in control. They silenced people to feel strong. They used distance to manipulate, but now silence haunts them. It isn't coming from you, it's surrounding them from everywhere. No comfort, no answer, no release. The very stillness you lived through is now suffocating them. They'll check their phone and no one will call. They'll try to explain their side and no one will listen. They'll reach for connection and feel emptier than ever. And it won't be because you've turned away. It'll be because heaven has closed a door they thought would always stay open. There's something terrifying about being surrounded by silence when you're used to being heard. It's in that isolation that people begin to see who they really are, and what they will see is the face of someone who hurt a soul that loved them, who discarded someone who would have stayed, who used silence to control and is now being crushed by it. The silence you endured gave you strength, but the silence they now face will break them because it carries the weight of their own actions. And when there's no one left to listen, when even God goes quiet, they will finally understand the language of pain. God doesn't forget the quiet suffering of the innocent. In a world where noise demands attention, where loudness is mistaken for strength and visibility for value, the silent suffering of the innocent often goes unnoticed by men, but never by God. He is the one who sees what others overlook. He watches the pain hidden behind smiles. the prayers whispered through trembling lips, the tears wiped away before anyone else could see. God takes no suffering lightly, especially when it is endured quietly, humbly, and without revenge. There is a divine record kept, not in books, but in spirit. Every time your heart ached in silence, every night you laid awake trying to understand why you weren't enough for someone you gave your soul to, God was watching. Every insult you swallowed without replying, every betrayal you forgave without being asked, every time you held back your truth just to avoid making things worse, He took note. And while the world may have thought your silence was weakness, heaven was writing down your restraint as righteousness. God never asks us to be doormats, but sometimes He allows us to endure injustice so that we might become vessels of greater strength, greater grace, and greater testimony. He does not forget what you've been through, especially when you didn't broadcast it. He does not overlook pain just because it was endured quietly. On the contrary, He stores that pain in a sacred space, and one day He uses it not only to heal you, but to speak on your behalf. The silence that others interpreted as you moving on or letting it go wasn't surrender to defeat, it was surrender to God. And He honors that. He honors the broken-hearted who didn't become bitter. He honors the betrayed who didn't turn vengeful. He honors those who chose mercy instead of wrath, not because they weren't angry, but because they trusted Him more than their emotions. When you suffer in silence, people think you're okay. They assume you've accepted the mistreatment, that you're unbothered. But God knows the truth. He knows how many times you nearly broke. He knows the prayers you didn't even have words for. He knows how many times you cried in a bathroom, in your car, in your bed, because the weight of it all was too much to carry in public. And so He acts, not always immediately, but always perfectly. He doesn't just restore what was taken. He ensures that those who cause the pain come to understand it, not through your revenge, but through His justice. And sometimes that justice looks like silence. The very silence they used to ignore you becomes the silence heaven uses to correct them. God is not like man. He doesn't need reminders or receipts. He doesn't need evidence or explanation. Your silent suffering was enough. Your tears were a testimony. And heaven is never deaf to pain that has no voice. In fact, God leans in closer to the silent sufferer. He draws near to the broken-hearted. He binds the wounds that no one else can see. And while the world may celebrate the loud and overlook the meek, God always honors those who hurt quietly but trust deeply. The same silence that was once your prison becomes the very place God builds your strength. And He never forgets a single moment of it. The weight of being unheard will fall back on those who silenced you. When someone chooses to ignore your pain, to minimize your emotions, to silence your voice, not just by what they say, but by what they refuse to say, they are not just committing emotional cruelty. They are writing a sentence that life itself will read back to them one day. Because the weight of being unheard doesn't vanish, it travels, it waits, and it always finds its way home. You begged with your eyes, you pleaded with your patience, you stretched your soul to make space for their flaws, their bad days, their coldness, and yet when it was your turn to be heard, to be seen, they gave you silence. Not the comforting kind, but the dismissive kind, the kind that says, "You're not worth understanding. You don't matter enough to respond to." And that silence crushed you. It made you doubt your worth. It made you question your sanity. It made you feel invisible. But God saw it all. And here's the thing about being silenced unjustly. It creates a spiritual imbalance. It sets in motion a reckoning. When someone consistently refuses to hear the cry of another, they sow a seed that eventually blooms into their own isolation, not as revenge, but as consequence. Because when you make a habit of silencing others, you eventually silence your own soul. You lose touch with empathy. You become deaf to love. And one day you wake up in a world that no longer echoes back to you. They didn't know what they were doing when they dismissed you. They thought they had the upper hand, that their silence was control. But all they were doing was digging a grave of isolation for themselves. Because silence, when used as a weapon, always returns. It wraps around the soul like a fog, unseen by others but deeply suffocating. And that's what they'll feel. The same weight you carried, the questioning, the aching, the hoping, will return to them. Only this time, no one will answer. No one will reach out. No one will comfort. And they will wonder why. Why the room feels cold. Why the prayers feel unheard. Why they feel like they're screaming underwater. It's not karma in the petty sense. It's not about getting even. It's about balance. And God is the master of restoring balance. He allows silence to become a teacher, a mirror, and sometimes a prison. And the one who silenced you will find themselves locked in the very quiet they once used to dominate you. The weight of being unheard is a heavy one. It doesn't come suddenly. It creeps in, one unanswered moment at a time. And when it builds, it doesn't scream. It suffocates. It hollows the heart, it dismantles confidence, and in that weight, the silencer finally becomes the silent. They'll finally feel the ache of saying everything in their heart and being met with silence. And in that silence, they will remember you, not as a victim, but as the voice they should have listened to, the one they shut out, the one God never stopped listening to. True justice often comes in the same form as the pain you endured. There's a divine symmetry to the way God writes justice into the human story. It doesn't always arrive as lightning or fire. Sometimes it walks in quietly, wearing the same face as the pain you once carried, not to harm, but to reveal, not to destroy, but to correct. The most powerful form of justice is not what we imagine, loud punishment, public shame, or dramatic reversals. No, the truest justice is when the very thing someone used to hurt you becomes the thing that humbles them, when the same silence they weaponized against you begins to echo in their own life, unanswered and unrelenting. When they walked away from you in silence, they thought they were in control. When they refused to respond, when they left your messages unread, your tears unseen, and your heart misunderstood, they felt powerful, as if silence was some kind of victory. But silence is not always a sign of control. Sometimes it's a signal of cowardice, of someone unwilling to face the truth of what they've done. And so they used it to create distance, not just between you and them, but between their actions and their accountability. But God does not allow silence to go unchecked. He doesn't forget the wounds inflicted by absence, nor the cruelty of emotional withdrawal. When someone deliberately chooses to let another person suffer without explanation, they are sowing a seed, and the harvest doesn't always come immediately. But it does come, and when it does, it often looks strikingly familiar. That is justice in its purest form, when life returns the same shape of pain they once delivered. It begins with small things. The phone that doesn't ring, the messages that go unanswered, the moments when they need someone, not for flattery or convenience, but for real connection, and no one comes. The people they once relied on begin to drift. Not because of you, but because of the invisible thread of justice God weaves through time. What they thought they had control over silence, distance, coldness starts to control them, and they don't know how to respond because they were never the ones to endure it. They were the ones who imposed it. Now they are the ones left on red. They are the ones talking into emptiness. They are the ones wondering what changed, why the warmth is gone, why the affection has turned to air. And the answer is simple. The form of pain they once delivered has found its way home. Not because you cursed them, not because you sought revenge, but because justice echoes, and God lets it echo in the same tone it was first spoken. They will feel the sting of silence in their most vulnerable moments, in times when they need reassurance and receive none, in moments when they look around for comfort and find only isolation, in seasons when they finally understand what it means to cry out and be met with stillness. And it will not be your silence this time, it will be heaven's. You once begged for closure, for clarity, for compassion, and you received none. Now they will beg for peace, for connection, for restoration, and they will feel what you felt, not as punishment, but as understanding. That is the kind of justice that changes people. That doesn't just correct behavior, but confronts the soul. Because when someone suffers the same shape of pain they once caused, they finally see the full picture of what they did. They may try to deny it at first. They may blame others, but deep down, a mirror will form, and every unanswered call, every distant heart, every cold silence will remind them of how they once treated you. And in that realization, justice is born. It's not about revenge, it's about reflection. It's about God showing them in the most personal and undeniable way that what we give to others returns, not in a cruel way, but in a way that cannot be avoided. The silence you endured built you, but the silence they now face will break them, because it is unfamiliar, because it is deserved, because it speaks without words. This is how God restores balance, by letting the form of pain return in its original shape. So they will not just feel guilty, they will understand. And in that understanding they will finally see what they refused to see before, that the silence they gave you was not strength, it was harm, and now that harm becomes their teacher. And now you see it clearly. What once broke you is not the end of your story, but the evidence of how deeply God was involved all along. The silence that once suffocated you became the sacred place where He preserved you. The wounds that were ignored became the very reasons heaven rose to your defense. You were never forgotten, you were never forsaken. You were simply being positioned for justice that would echo back in the same form it was delivered. They thought your silence was weakness, but God called it strength. They thought their silence would never catch up with them, but God turned it into a mirror. You didn't have to lift a hand or raise your voice, because heaven was watching. Heaven was recording, and heaven responded not with noise, but with the same silence they used to harm you. Only this time, it speaks louder than any scream. Let this be your peace. You don't have to make anyone see your worth. You don't have to beg to be heard. The one who sees in secret has already made your pain His cause. And now He lets the one who hurt you be crushed, not by revenge, not by wrath, but by the same silence they once thought would never return. Trust in the God who sees all. He is never silent for no reason. He is simply waiting for the right moment to speak without words and still be heard by every heart that needs to hear Him most.